worst chain I could be using for this.
Old piece of shit chain?
Old piece of shit dog leash chain.
Hey Internet, if you've just become aware of this project, be sure to check out the introduction video in the description at some point. It'll fill you in with my plans for this car. A long time ago, one of the first things I did for this swap was to remove the original engine and transmission so I could see how my VW diesel and T5 would fit. I had to cut away some of the driveshaft tunnel to get it back far enough, but luckily the shifter still landed in a reasonable spot.
Wow.
In the absence of an engine lift, I just stuck a pipe in my engine stand to act as a substitute. To make sure I was putting the engine in the right spot, I checked my footage of the first fit up and marked the position of the front face of the bell housing in the frame. I tacked on a piece of heavy angle iron to hold the frame in shape because several important pieces were in the way and had to go. Now, I know these cars aren't especially valuable right now, but I also know that this one could easily outlast me, and someday it might make sense to put it back to factory condition. That's why I kept everything I cut out and crated up the original engine and trans to stay with the car. Still, I hope the next owner values my modifications, and if I don't like what they do with it, I reserve the right to haunt them. I made a couple wood fixtures to hold everything centered in the frame. There are 3 connection points on each side of the frame for motor mounts, or rather 2 that are meant for it and a third that I'm repurposing to cope with the extra torque. When you've got 3 holes to plot out with irregular spacing, the easiest way to do it is to measure the sides of the triangle they form. I scribed a line parallel to the edge of my piece to put the first 2 marks on, then set the calipers to the next 2 measurements and used it like a compass to scribe arcs. The point they meet at defines the last hole. This part of the mount will have a tube welded in to hold a rubber bushing. I didn't want to use the angle grinder to make a semicircular cut, so I used a hole saw, sacrificing my ears in the name of convenience and accuracy. I wanted to gusset to stiffen the whole thing up, and it had to be bent to make a perpendicular joint with the tube. It's overkill for sure, but it would have felt weird not making an obvious reinforcement. This half of the motor mount will have leaf spring bushings pressed in to dampen some vibration. When this engine was in my Jedi, it would move a lot with that diesel torque at startup. These mounts will allow decidedly less movement, and now the engine is positioned longitudinally in a 1,700-pound car that's less than 5 feet wide, so startups are going to shake this car enough to give it a syndrome. The original motor mount placement was asymmetrical, and I'm sure it was like that for a reason, so I kept it that way when I made the second mount. If you've ever seen me fabricate things, you know I hate paying for materials, so this is me making a long rectangular tube out of a short square one. I capped the back of it with a different piece of scrap later. To complete the mounts, the halves that attach to the engine need 2 tabs each that straddle the rubber bushings. A single bolt per side pins it all together. Somehow the diesel sits further back than the original engine, so the mounts need to stick out in front of the engine a bit. I intentionally left this protrusion long so I could put it in place and trim it to fit. Since the front of the protrusion would hold the first tab, I used the face of the bushing to scribe my cutting lines. If it doesn't look square, that's because it isn't. None of the mounting surfaces align nicely with any of the others, except for one, and that's just because of a convenient but accidental warp in my welds. Before mocking up the tabs, I used a clamp to pull the engine into vertical alignment. I set up two straight edges so that when they touched, the center line of the cylinders would be directly above the crankshaft. I made some cardboard mock-ups for the tabs, just test fitting and trimming as necessary before cutting out the steel ones. When it was time to tack them in place, I used the ass end of a spring clamp to hold the mount up against the engine because it was too much work to run the bolts all the way in. This is the last time I'm trying this, so it better be good. What you're seeing is actually the third attempt to weld on these tabs, because I kept forgetting to make sure everything was actually in the right position. I had to break the tacks twice, among other inconveniences of my own making. Passenger side was more complicated because there weren't three convenient bolt holes in the same plane, and the rubber bushing is further from the engine because of that asymmetrical placement I mentioned. It made more sense to tack all of it together on the engine, so I made the first parts and hinged them so they would bend into position. I went to the drill press to make myself a tool out of a piece of bolt. It is meant to screw into the hole I'm trying to use so I can put my steel over it and tap it for a center mark. I'm pretty sure you can buy these, but why pay for something good when good enough is free? This is going on the side of the engine with the exhaust and turbocharger, so I chamfered off as much of it as possible. It might still interfere, but the engine has to be attached to the car before I can worry about that. In fact, if I remember correctly, the driver's side mount had to use a bolt hole that the alternator needs, but getting that to fit somewhere was going to be a problem anyway. Really, the diesel doesn't need electricity to run, so worst case I park on hills to bump start it and never drive in the dark. Yeah, I modeled this in CAD. Cardboard aided design.
Check that shit out.
With the engine finally resting on two mounts, it was time to move on to the part I was avoiding, the transmission mount. It's more inconvenient because it goes underneath the trans, and I had less of an idea of how it needed to be done in general. I actually made half of it before I realized it wouldn't work and had to start over. I used the original holes, but the underside of the flange for more clearance to the larger new transmission. Pretty early on, it was clear I needed more room around the frame, so I put the whole chassis up on sawhorses.
I'm going to be using just half of one of those leaf spring bushings for the transmission mount back here. It's going to be oriented in this direction, and I think if I ever want to be able to get the engine and transmission back out once the car is together, I'm going to need to be able to undo the mount from above through the trans tunnel cover inside the car. So that means these threads are in the way and I have to drill them out. And if I do that, there's no putting them back really, so hope I'm making the right decision here. Come on. You can do it.
With the transmission threads gone, the mount itself would need threads to accept a bolt. I didn't have any plain nuts the right size, so I ground off the swaged part of some lock nuts to get rid of the nylon. I could have just used through bolts, but my design intuition is much like polite society in that it doesn't appreciate loose nuts. The mounting surface of the transmission is at some weird angle, but I imagine whatever that was supposed to do for vibration dampening is less relevant now that the engine can hardly move. Since I'm using a single bolt, I used a web in the casting to define a center line on a piece of cardboard. That way I could scribe a matching angle on the steel version and use it to align the first two parts on the bench. When I welded on the second tab, I used the steel bushing that will go in the rubber to hold the proper spacing. It ended up pulling together anyway. First, I tried jacking them apart with a bolt and nuts.
Oh, come on.
When that wasn't good enough, I tried prying directly with a wrench. And when that wasn't good enough, I just sanded the bushing until it fit. Here's what I came up with for the second half. It was not easy to cut with an angle grinder.
What the fuck is the problem?
Wasn't real easy to bolt on either. When I put the first mount back on the transmission, I assembled it with the rubber bushing as well as the steel tube that it gets pressed into. So with the second piece bolted to the frame, I could start welding it to the tube.
Ugh. Good thing I have 3 extra bushings. It's gonna be on fire by the time I'm done with this. Yeah. Come on. Oh man, this is gonna be no fun to get back on. Well, there is the last mount. Might put a couple little webs on here on either side of it just so it's a little less bendy, but honestly this is going to be the least loaded of any of the mounts and it probably doesn't need it. I'm not going to bother putting it on just yet because the next step is going to require lifting the engine and transmission back out of the chassis so I can patch up all the holes I just cut in the frame.
That'll be the subject of the next Spitfire video. Until then, probably a bunch of unrelated stuff. Hope to see you next time.
Fuck, come on.